When we study Europe in the late Middle Ages from about 1200 to 1450, we find a region that was riddled with many small states, most of which were monarchies. Within these states, monarchs often struggled to maintain authority over noble families who were sometimes more influential and wealthier than their kings. Moreover, conflicts between states were common, and very often truces were ephemeral. They didn't last long at all. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the European population was largely divorced from these political struggles, as they labored in Europe's main economic activity, agricultural production. And over it all, influencing both peasant and noble, were the religious values of Christianity. At this time, about 80% of Europe's population lived in a rural setting, but that 80% included clergy and nobles as well as peasants. A clergy are people associated with the church. Clergy who lived in the countryside were most usually monks or nuns, and they lived in isolated monasteries, or they were parish priests who managed churches and villages. Noble families, who controlled most of Europe's land, lived in the countryside so they could better manage their lands. Most people who lived in the countryside, though, were peasants, and the overwhelming majority of them were agricultural workers. Throughout the Middle Ages, Europe's overwhelming economic focus was agricultural production and animal husbandry, growing crops and raising animals for food. In any period in history, agricultural production requires enormous amounts of human labor in order to be a successful enterprise. Europe's solution to this required labor was to create a system called Manorialism, which utilized the labor of people categorized as peasants and serfs. In Europe, individual properties were known as manors, and these manors were owned by noble families and sometimes by church officials. These manor owners, the lords of the manor, often owned multiple manors, and so they traveled between their properties to oversee the management of those lands. The people who lived in hamlets and villages on these lands provided the labor force for the manors. These laborers were broadly called peasants. Some peasants were free laborers who were paid for their work, usually by being given a portion of the harvest. Peasant families sometimes owned small farms that they managed in addition to working on the manor. Up to half of all peasants, and in some places more than half of all peasants, were categorized as serfs. Serfs were coerced laborers, that is, in exchange for the protection of the manor lord and for being allowed to live as tenants on the land, they were required to work on the manor's lands. Moreover, unlike peasants who could move away from a manor if they wanted to, serfs were legally tied to the land. They could not move away or marry without the lord's permission. However, serfs weren't entirely unfree. That is, they weren't categorized as slaves. And yes, slaves did exist in medieval Europe. Slaves were most often non-Christian peoples, often from still pagan Eastern Europe or from Muslim areas around the Mediterranean basin. By about 1300, most slaves had transitioned to serfdom in Western and Central Europe, but the institution of slavery did remain in areas around the Mediterranean. Unlike slaves who were owned by other people and rarely had the opportunity to gain any sort of personal wealth, serfs could save money. They weren't owned by a person but were tied to land. Serfs could even become landowners, if their lords allowed it. Serfs spent most of their time working on the lord's lands. In their limited free time, they could cultivate food for their own families in the common areas of the manor. They could go hunting or fishing to supplement their families' diets as well. So, medieval Europe depended on both free peasants and coerced serfs, laborers, to produce the various agricultural products that formed the backbone of Europe's economy. Agricultural laborers, despite their incredibly important work, had almost no political influence in medieval Europe. While manorialism was the economic system supporting Europe, it only partly helps to explain the social organization in Europe at this time. Manorialism's laborers, peasants, and serfs were at the lowest level of the social structure, and we know they had no power. So, who did have power, and why? During Europe's Middle Ages, a person's level of political power and status was largely dependent on three things: your family ties, your family wealth, and your perceived gender. Europe was patriarchal. Women usually had very little political power or influence, and usually didn't control their own wealth, not even in noble families. Back then, wealth came in the form of land. The more land your family owned, the more wealthy your family was. And, generally speaking, the only people who could own land were those whose families had fought for and been loyal to the monarch. In fact, it was the relationship between the monarch and his loyal followers, his vassals, which formed the basis of Europe's social system, which was called feudalism. The feudal system theorized that the ruler, the monarch, owned all of the land in the kingdom. The monarch then rewarded those who'd fought for him and been loyal to him with gifts of land, with manors. These followers were called vassals. Vassals were always nobles. In fact, families initially gained recognition as nobility when they served the monarch faithfully. Vassals, especially those who came to own lots of land, could in turn give gifts of land to their followers and establish vassals of their own. You can see this illustrated on the graphic where, in the lower level of vassalage, you see the knightly class. Knights were professional medieval soldiers. These internal hierarchies of vassalage are why various states recognize levels of noble titles. Someone who is a prince or princess is directly related to the monarch. The title duke or duchess originally recognized more distant members of the royal family. The title earl or countess originally recognized a monarch's most loyal followers, and etc. down the line of noble titles. As you can imagine, non-noble people, city dwellers, artisans, peasants, serfs, etc., formed the bottom of the feudal hierarchy, which is usually illustrated as a pyramid. Even though these people were important economically, they had no social influence or political power, and so were largely excluded from policy making. Every time a monarch went to war and was successful, he, monarchs are almost always male because of patriarchy, rewarded his vassals with land. It's a great system to keep people invested in one monarch and one royal family, but over time, it was also a system that created imbalances. While the monarch was supposed to be in charge, in reality, vassals sometimes became more wealthy and more influential than the monarchs. At times, these powerful vassals, often called magnates, married into the royal family or broke their promises of loyalty and challenged the royal family for control. Rather than risk such chaos, it was often easier for monarchs to allow their vassals to be powerful in their own lands as long as they paid lip service to the loyalty to their monarch. There were some empires in Europe at this time. Generally speaking, empires tend to be more centrally organized in order to control big territories. However, Europe's empires weren't very powerful. The Byzantine Empire was in the east, basically modern-day Turkey and Greece. It had been established way back in the 5th century and had once encompassed nearly the entire Mediterranean basin. However, by 1300, it was already falling apart. It would be conquered by the Ottomans in 1453. The Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe was established in the 10th century, but it was more a confederation of states than a traditional empire. It was an empire in name only. All of the crests on this painting at the top right represent the very many states that made up the Holy Roman Empire. And so, Europe maintained a system of political decentralization, a system where there's little central authority within a state for centuries. In fact, in 1215, King John of England was forced to recognize this decentralization by signing the Magna Carta, a document which recognized the rights of England's nobles and set some limits to the power of the monarch. Vassals in England and elsewhere treated their own territories as mini kingdoms within a larger state, and as long as they didn't challenge the monarch outright, they got to keep right on doing that. So, this seems like a pretty fragile system, right? This political system that's based on a feudal system, which is based on inequality, What stops a vassal who knows he's more powerful than the monarch from just taking over? Was there maybe another factor at play? Spoiler alert, there was. In fact, there were several. For one, the more you have, the more you risk. If a powerful vassal challenged the monarch and lost, then he risked losing all his lands too, right? That risk was sometimes just too big to take. Beyond that, though, was the belief that when you swore loyalty to the monarch, you did so with all your being, with your soul as well as your body. And matters of the soul were incredibly important to medieval people. Medieval Europeans were overwhelmingly Christian, but they didn't all belong to the same Christian denomination. In 1054, the Christian church had split into two churches. Western and Central Europeans were Roman Catholic, while Eastern Europeans, mostly people living in the Byzantine Empire and what is today Russia, were Greek Orthodox. This split was fairly significant because each region in Europe had a particular tradition with regards to the relationship between the Christian church and the civil, that is, the non-religious, state. In the East, the tradition was that the monarch, first the Byzantine emperor and later the Russian Tsar, had significant influence over the institution of the church. It was in many ways a symbiotic relationship. Orthodox religious authorities who governed themselves with councils supported rulers and, in turn, rulers protected the Orthodox clergy. Byzantine and Russian rulers, though, were also often dealing directly with people of different religious traditions. Both of these states fought against Muslim states. In fact, the Byzantine Empire would eventually fall to the Muslim Ottomans. Perhaps because of that situation, Orthodox authorities exempted the emperor from censure and allowed him to, in some cases, dictate institutional decisions, such as approving local religious leaders, although emperors had no authority when deciding matters of faith. So, in the East, civil authorities did have some authority over religious institutions. The relationship between church and civil authorities was much more fluid in Western and Central Europe. Unlike most of Europe's states, the Catholic Church was centralized. There was a singular leader for all Roman Catholics, the Pope, who maintained a court in Rome. From Rome, the Pope and other church leaders called cardinals governed the church. They developed laws to govern moral behavior and determine punishments for sins. They collected money, called the tithe, from all Catholics and usually redispersed it across the Roman Catholic world. Their government was much more connected than that of other European states. Importantly, it was the Pope and his advisors who determined promotion within the church. They named important regional leaders called bishops who served both as priests and as administrators of the church in their various territories. As the church owned property across all of Europe, monasteries, church buildings, lands, etc., this meant the church was, in some ways, just like another noble family interacting with civil authorities in Europe's various kingdoms. Except this particular noble family was huge, with influence all across Europe. Popes and church officials believed that their spiritual authority should grant them influence over monarchs and all other civil rulers. As you can imagine, though, this kind of extensive influence was viewed with suspicion by monarchs. Often, Europe's monarchs sought to intervene in church affairs. They'd try to name their own bishops, for example, to ensure that the person who became bishop was loyal to the king. Church authorities, and especially the Pope, viewed such action as immoral. It was a sin that deserved punishment. Unsurprisingly, the power struggle that often characterized the relationship between a monarch and his vassals was also seen in the relationship between a monarch and the church authorities in his kingdom. Were these monarchs practicing Catholics who believed in the Catholic faith, who went to church and generally followed the values of their faith? Absolutely they were. But were these monarchs also powerful men who were trying to protect their own power bases in their own kingdoms from the church? Oh yes, absolutely yes. So, relations between these monarchs and the Roman Catholic Church seemed ever fluid. Sometimes they were close allies, with monarchs depending on the Catholic clergy for legitimacy and support. Sometimes, however, they were enemies, with some monarchs even raising armies and marching against church authorities, or supporting rival popes on those occasions when the church was in chaos. Of course, not everyone in Europe was Christian. In the east, the Muslim Ottomans were building an empire in the Balkans. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Emirate of Granada in the south was also a Muslim state. While European Muslims sometimes traveled outside of their states, they most usually did so via Muslim routes. That is, they sailed across the Mediterranean or sailed first to Africa and then traveled overland. In general, Christians and Muslims viewed one another with great suspicion. Their states rarely had friendly diplomatic relationships. There wasn't a lot of mixing of Christian and Muslim communities. As you've already learned, the Muslim faith played an enormous and obvious role in Muslim government and in Muslim law, and even on the social structures in Muslim states. While Christianity was often influential in some ways, it was often not the basis for these institutions in Europe. Judaism was also practiced across Europe. European Jews were scattered throughout the continent. As with Muslims, Christians tended to view Jews with suspicion, and even though Jewish families had lived within the borders of some European states for centuries, they were still viewed as outsiders. In some states, laws prevented Jews from owning land, and so many European Jews were city dwellers by default. The vast majority of European Christians, living as they did in the countryside, probably never came into contact with a Jewish person. Well, despite these various restrictions, European Jews established strong communities across Europe. These communities were often connected together by commercial ties, as banking and trade were some of the job opportunities still open to Jews. Jewish communities were united by a shared language, Hebrew. Even when two Jews didn't speak the same first language because, say, one was from France and another from Austria, they could still communicate because all Jews learned Hebrew so they could read the Torah and participate in religious life. This language formed a basis for their community across Europe. European Jews stood outside of the manorial and feudal systems for the most part, but they nonetheless contributed to the states in which they lived. In the Spanish kingdom of Castilla in the Iberian Peninsula, Jews served as advisors to King Pedro I in the 14th century. Of course, his brother reversed course and persecuted Spanish Jews. In England, Jews were considered royal serfs, which in this case actually granted Jews significant freedom of movement, mostly because English kings benefited from the trade that Jews brought to England. In 1290, however, King Edward I expelled all the Jews from England. Italian Jews translated many Arabic works into Latin in the 13th century for the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. But yes, Jews were subject to sporadic waves of violence across the Holy Roman Empire as well, especially during the years of the Black Death in the 14th century, as evidenced by this image at the bottom right of Jews being massacred by villagers. Europe between 1200 and 1450 was a place of much similarity. Most people were Christian. Most people were of non-noble status. Most people were agricultural workers. States were decentralized, and this lack of a central authority meant that military conflict was common, both within states and between states. In fact, this era in Europe would end in a huge war, the 100 Years' War, fought intermittently between 1337 and 1453. This was a war which challenged Europe's medieval structures. The outcome of the 100 Years' War shaped European politics for centuries, and it helped bring about a definitive end to the European Middle Ages.